Hello and welcome to the Career Change podcast. Today I'm speaking to Julie B, who is a burnout strategist, and we're going to talk all about the ins and outs of a burnout and what you can do to prevent it, and also her own experience with burnout. So I think it's going to be a very interesting and informative episode. Hi, Julie. Thanks for being here today.
Hey, Christy, I'm so happy to be here with you and your audience, and hopefully, we will get some answers to burnout during this episode and, help your audience out.
I definitely think we will because I think for a lot of people, it's very new. I think a lot of people are not even aware that they have a burnout.
Mhm.
What I also hear from women is that only once they really hit rock bottom and it's going really bad with them, that's when they realize, oh, maybe, I'm experiencing a burnout. I don't know how it's by you, but here in the Netherlands for a very long time, it was just something sort of swept under the carpet and it wasn't really real, it wasn't really recognized. People were also a bit embarrassed about talking about it, and I feel like now it's slowly really like coming more like that people are more open about it and talking, and I'm just hearing more, not only clients but also friends, family that have experienced it. So it's, I think we're going the right way, that at least we're becoming more open and honest about it, because by doing that we can actually do something about it
Yeah,
and prevent it.
you can't fix a problem unless you're willing to talk about it. I think that's the first step, and it is a fairly new. It's not new in the workplace, but it's newly defined as a workplace problem. And in fact, the WHO didn't define it until 2019. So you think
Wow.
about, that was not, that's only a few years ago that the WHO, the World Health Organization, first defined burnout as a workplace phenomenon. I think it's more than just the workplace. I disagree with that part of the definition, but yeah, that's kind of where we are. So we are really on the forefront of dealing with some of these things that I think have been in the workplace for a really long time.
Mm. Yeah, people just probably didn't even know, that they had it. They just thought they were tired, maybe.
Hmm.
So, could you maybe? I'm quite curious about your own experience with burnout, and what caused it for you to get it, but also what did you do to get out of it?
Yeah, I've had three pretty massive rounds of burnout. The first round, I did not even understand what was happening because it was in 2003, and I was working for a big four accounting firm here in the United States, and the typical 80 to 90 hour week situation for an associate at a big four accounting firm. And that time, I didn't really understand what was going on. Burnout wasn't even a word on my radar. I was, 22. I was a kid still in my first job, and I just thought, like, this is life. This is what you do. And I was very, very depressed and I got sick like all the time. I remember one point I ended up with pneumonia in both lungs and had to actually go on short-term disability to recover from that. So not something a fairly healthy 22-year-old should have to go through. And looking back, I realized it was the pace of work that got me there. Didn't see it at the time because I just thought that that's what we were supposed to do. So that story probably resonates with a lot of your audience. That was really my first burnout. But the second one came in I want to say 2012, which ultimately that was when I was running my own business and things were going great. We were growing, and that was it came after having some success in business. And that one ultimately ended with me having to have surgery and take 6 weeks off of work. Um, and then the last one was in 2021. And that was the tipping point for me to write a book about it because I knew what was happening. I knew I was burning out and I didn't do anything about it. And I, there were no resources out there for specifically for business owners and specifically for people who are like leaders and managers, people who control the workplace, people who have some control over how the workplace feels every day. And I just thought that that was an interesting topic. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that a resource that needed to exist. And so that's how I ended up writing the book. The way I got out of all of those was it was a mixture of just self care, reflection, and honestly making some changes, setting some boundaries, and just knowing learning what burnout looks like on me so that I don't repeat the same mistakes or the same habits, I guess I should say, that got me into those situations.
So why do you feel like the third time it happened, you knew, you felt like the signs, but how come you didn't do anything about it then?
That was well, one, I didn't really have there's this thing with business owners that, and I imagine for your audience too, that you you kind of feel like you pick the path that you're on, so you just kind of have to suck it
Mhm.
up and get through it. That's a very high achiever mentality when you kind of hit that point in your work career where you know you're working too much. And it wasn't even, honestly, it wasn't even that I was working too much. I probably wasn't working more than 40 hours a week during that time, but it was the stress of what I was dealing with.
Mm.
And it was almost all of it was out of my control. It was the industry that my business was in. It was what was going on in the world. This was late 2021. So we had gone through like the first wave of COVID and then a second wave of COVID. There were a lot of factors outside of my control. And my friends were telling me I was doing too much. They were telling me I was burning out or I was going to burn out. And I just didn't listen. And it took, I woke up one morning, thought I was having a heart attack, went
Sure.
to the emergency room. I mean, and it was the whole 9 yards. It was the chest pain, shortness of breath, sweating, nausea, all of that. And I was in the emergency room for 8 hours. They did like all of the tests, and basically I had a panic attack. I'd never had a full blown panic attack like that before, so I didn't really know what that was when when it was going, when you really feel like you're dying when you have a panic attack. Like there's no other way to describe it. And that was when I realized how serious that had gotten. I was like, something's got to change here. I've got to do something differently. um and I didn't want to ever go through that again. So I don't know, like part of it is third time's the charm, part of it is just age. You get to a point, you get to an age where you're just like, I can't keep doing this to my body. Your early 20s, your body can sustain stuff like that. Even in your 30s, your body can sustain stuff like that, or can, put up with it. But I had just turned 40, and my body was not handling it. It was not a good thing. And so I knew that I had to make some changes if I was going to have another, 20, 30, 40 years of life, whatever it is, good years. I had to make some changes for sure. So that I don't really have a great answer as to why it took three times or why it was that one, but it was definitely that one that changed it for me.
I think also if you have your own business, it's very difficult to stop, because you have to earn your own income and pay the bills, and there's just maybe also drive, or like also because you enjoy the work, because it's for yourself, so it's more
Hmm.
rewarding.
Hmm.
That then it's also more difficult. I mean, I even notice with myself sometimes that I'm like working in the weekends or working at night, and then I'm also like, what am I doing? Like I should take a break.
Yeah, what one piece of advice I would give your audience, because I know they're career women, and I'm sure some of them are business owners, but if you are thinking about leaving your career to start a business, I would highly recommend you read my book before you jump into it, because you'll know. I really think most business owners burn out at one point or another. I don't think it's an if, I think it's a when situation.
Wow.
Mainly because at this point I know I've talked to over 1,000 business owners, and I can fewer than 10 have said that they've never burned out, that they've never gotten to the point of burnout. And so it's almost it's a pretty safe bet that as a business owner, you're going to hit a wall and you're going to burn out. And the more educated you are around what that might look like, and what might cause that also, and the better off you're going to be, because my goal is to catch it before it gets all the way into where you're experiencing the physical signs of burnout, like the depression, the exhaustion, the panic attacks, before you get to that point. Because I really think that if we catch it before it gets to that stage of burnout, that there is still an opportunity to kind of course correct and turn it around before you get into some of those really bad physical symptoms.
Mm. So when I was in a job, I got fired pretty much.
Hmm.
I was working in a project management company, and it was a lot of projects and very stressful.
Hmm.
But I don't know if I got in a burnout, but I do know that I have was depressed for a couple of years,
Hmm.
and I also, I'm not sure, it could have also been a bit after this. I don't know the exact years, but what I do know is at the company I got um, shingles here,
Wow.
on the side here, and it was
Hmm.
very painful.
Yeah.
So do you think that was also a form of a burnout, or do you say no, that could have been something else? Or
I mean, I have to give the disclaimer right now. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a mental health practitioner. I am someone who has seen a lot, and I, do have gone through a lot of therapy. It could easily have been, uh, burnout could have led you to get the shingles. I mean, something in your body causes that.
mm,
But for example, I'll give you two brief examples of my own thing. So in my second burnout in 2012, I ended up, so I was 31 at the time, 31, 32. I ended up having to have surgery for acid reflux.
mm,
Not many 33-year-olds need to have surgery for acid reflux, but I had had such intense problems with that because of all the stress that, I mean, it was, I was a wreck. Like, it was a mess, but I was basically on a trajectory to end up with like esophageal cancer, and there was like medicine wasn't cutting it. Like, there was nothing that was fixing it, and so I ended up having to have surgery at 32 for basically acid reflux, really bad acid reflux, but that was what happened. And then the other thing that I will tell you is that I know that I'm stressed. One of the ways now that I know, because I've been able to tune into my body and I know kind of what is going on, my right shoulder, like, I have an old basketball injury, I have an old sports injury. And when I get really stressed, my right shoulder will start to ache and hurt and just feel bad. And there was a moment during all of that, during the second burnout, that was also happening, and I thought I was going to have shoulder surgery. I have had shoulder surgery in the past to fix
mm,
the problem with the my shoulder basically kept dislocating. um, but I thought I was going to have a second shoulder surgery, because, like, nothing, I mean, I was doing acupuncture, massage therapy, taking, all of the Tylenol and ibuprofen and all of that. Nothing was helping it until I started walking regularly and until I started meditating regularly. And those two things were, like, my shoulder got better. It seemed like it got better overnight. It was so fast that it got better. So now I know, like, when my shoulder starts aching in that certain way, that is actually stress. So those are just like a few examples of how stress can impact your body. And over the long term, like, if you don't address those things, it can lead to something like having to have surgery, or, shingles, which is a very painful thing to go through. I can't even imagine. I've never had it. Hopefully, I'll never get it. It won't. Hopefully, I'll be able to get the shot before, or the a vaccine before I get it. But you hear more and more about younger people having shingles, and sometimes I just wonder, like, is that partially stress in their lives? So it could have been, the outcome of being very stressed at work, for sure.
So what I notice now, if I'm stressed, I have tinnitus,
Hmm.
tinnitus, Is it in
Hmm.
English? For a couple of years already, but it like comes and goes, and I usually only really hear it at night.
Hmm.
For the rest, I don't hear it. But lately, I've been hearing it again, like quite loud. So
Hmm.
I'm thinking, this is maybe a sign that I'm, maybe doing too much,
Yeah.
or maybe a bit more stressed, or yeah.
Yeah. And there's there is definitely, there's a lot of research behind stress and burnout exacerbating conditions you already have. So I have asthma. So when I'm really stressed, I notice that I take my rescue inhaler more than I would normally take it. So that's, like it's also that thing where if you have something like tinnitus or ringing in the ears, stress can definitely, and burnout can definitely make it worse. It may not, be the cause of it, but it can definitely make it worse for sure. And that goes with anxiety, depression. I mean, anything, aches and pains, like my shoulder, I'm sure I've got some scar tissue in there, but on a day when I'm not stressed or not dealing with too much stress, it doesn't hurt, So, but on the days where I'm, a lot of stress and maybe heading towards burnout a little bit, I'm going to start feeling some aches and pains in my body.
I remember I always used, and I don't have that anymore, but when I was working in the office, I got very in pain here, very painful.
Yeah.
And yeah, when I
Yeah.
was stressed. But it's interesting because I've always, a lot of times I think also a lot of women, they think, well, if they're overworking, that's what could lead to burnout. But, also
Hmm.
like make sure you're not stressed, because I think a lot of
Hmm.
times we say like, oh, we were very stressed and then we all laugh it away kind of thing. But it's
Yeah.
actually more serious than what we think.
It's not always, and it's not always about the amount of work you're doing.
Mm,
That's one really interesting thing.
yeah.
I one of What is it? So, colleagues of mine, Maslach and Leiter, they've been studying workplace burnout since I want to say the 1970s, and they wrote a book a couple of years ago, and one of their research findings was that it's not necessarily the amount of work that you're doing that causes burnout. There's a lot of other things like it can contribute to it, but they assert, and I'm on board with this too. They assert that it's actually more about people feeling like they have control at work, people feeling like they have some type of autonomy at work, along with taking the accountability for anything that goes wrong. But that's a bigger part of burnout than actually the number of hours you're working or the pace at which you work. You can't work 90 hours a week or 80 hours a week all year long and not expect to burn out. But I mean, there are definitely times even now where I'm working 70 hours a week, but because I have the control of what I'm doing, I know where I'm going, and I'm really passionate about what I'm doing. I think that helps balance out the number of hours that a lot of us work. So that's a big part of it too. It's not just the amount of work that you're doing, it's like how you're doing it, how much control you have over it, and if you feel like you're making an impact. That's a big one too, like that fulfillment piece of work. If you're not, you could probably work, somebody could probably work at a job for 20 hours a week, and if they're not getting that fulfillment, they may burn out from work. So it's
Yeah,
really,
or out sort of if you're not being fulfilled. Like,
yeah, so you got to look at all pieces and parts of it. The one piece of advice I'd give your audience who are, if they're considering a career change, is to try to figure out what are they trying to, change? What do they want to, why are they wanting to change? What is the thing about their current work? It might be they're just in the wrong field. Like that actually happened with me. I finally realized that marketing had changed so much that it didn't align with my core values anymore. I couldn't do social media marketing for 70 clients anymore because it just, I was totally out of, like, all of the social networks were totally out of alignment with my own core values, and there was nothing that was going to fix that. So I ended up selling that business. But it's, those are just some things to consider if you're considering changing your career, no matter what it's going to be. Figuring out what is wrong with the current situation is a big part of making sure you take the right step in the next place.
so what they tell me is that because they experienced the burnout, they've gone to therapy and they've worked on themselves and they've sort of going on that personal development journey, and then they realize that they've actually changed and they feel like there's so much more inside of them and they actually want to be a lot more creative. and they'll also feel like their work is not really adding any meaning to the world, or they're really giving back to society. So a lot of times they really want to do something completely different.
Hmm.
For example, from being a marketing manager to doing interior design. So, actually really starting a whole new study.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and I think that I mean sometimes you need to do that. This is my third. I would say this is my third act in my career. I started out as an accountant,
wow.
and then I became a marketing agency owner. For I did that for 15 years, and now I'm a speaker, an author, and a consultant. And the three topics I talk the most about are burnout, leadership, and entrepreneurship. Sometimes all three of them kind of come together. Sometimes they're individual, just depending on who I'm talking to and the organization. But yeah, this is my third evolution of career, and that's I think that's fine. I mean, I think that that's the days of doing what you graduated from college for or whatever you trained for in your 20 early 20s. I don't know how many people stick with it their whole career. I mean, a lot, some do, a lot do, but there's also a lot more people changing career paths, and I think that comes from conversations like this. I think it comes from just a
Mhm.
realization of this industry or this job or this role is not for me anymore. I want to do something else. I want to do something more creative, or maybe sometimes they've done something very creative and they want to do something that's more just nuts and bolts, like I want to sell insurance. I mean, I've heard all kinds of things, and I just say, like, you do what makes you happy, but you got to transition in a way, in a smart way. You can't just leap, because that just sets you up for burnout if you don't have a really solid plan. Although I will say some people get into a position, they get so burned out that everybody is begging them to quit the job that they have, even if they don't have a job ready for them. So there are some extreme situations, but most of the time it takes some time to figure that out, and you can never go wrong investing in yourself. I think that putting money into yourself and figuring out your next steps, that's a very wise investment for somebody considering a change.
Well, I think what your story is incredibly like brave and really, I think, inspiring for also people watching or listening. Because I have a lot of clients who initially in the beginning they don't want to make the change because they fear change and they fear failure, and they like, yeah, but I've studied this, now I have to throw all my diplomas away. What are my parents going to think?
Hmm.
What are my friends going to think? Maybe I'm not going to fit in anymore. But you have just changed through times. Like, I'm
Yeah.
quite curious, actually, was it for you difficult to make that and scary to make that leap to go do something, or did it just gradually go and it just sort of
The I gotta tell you, I've been very fortunate that my career changes have kind of organically developed.
mm,
I worked in so I started my career at a big four at PricewaterhouseCoopers as a tax associate. Very quickly realized that was not like corporate cubicle, 8 to 8 type hours, stuck inside all day long, was not going to be my jam. Like, and at that time I didn't actually know I had ADHD. I'm the kid that had ADHD, and it presented in a way of overachieving, straight A student, scholar athlete, all of that stuff. So but there was just no way that was going to work for me. So then I went and I worked in accounting for several more years. But what I found was I was gravitating towards small business. So I went and worked for a company that was doing about 200 million in revenue, and then from there I went to a company that was doing 10, and we took it from 10 to 30 million in revenue a year.
wow.
And that was the place. Like, so all along I was actually learning about how to run a small business. And then the last stop before I actually started my own company, I really learned how to do a lot of. I mean, I worked right next to the business owner the whole time. I was their key employee, so I really got to see the entrepreneurial life, the world, and I fell in love with it. And so from there, and I also at that time I taught myself how to do a lot of digital marketing. Social media was coming out. SEO was like a brand new thing. We were building a website. We launched this huge website at the time before WordPress even existed. Just all these crazy things that I look back and I'm like, okay, so I was developing into marketing there. And so, the step to starting a marketing agency made sense because at that time it was very much self-taught. Like you were not going to find a college program for digital marketing. Now there are a bunch of them, but then there wasn't. So I started that business, and then while I ran that agency, I had these experiences with burnout, and I also did a lot of speaking, and I love to speak publicly. I'm not. It's one of those things where I feel most comfortable, I think, in that role. And also I was doing a ton of consulting for businesses, and so then I had this burnout experience. I wrote a book, and then I got a book deal, like on a whim. I pitched my book to a traditional publisher, and a month later I had a signed book contract.
Wow, that's cool.
And yeah, so I just kind of, that happened, and so now I'm like, okay, well, I'm clearly meant to. And during that, a lot of stuff was happening with social media. I mean, there's only so many times you can answer, how do I profit from COVID, or how do we market in a way that helps us profit from COVID. Like, I had clients asking me that, and then I had clients asking me the same thing about, like, how do we profit on Black Lives Matter. And then there was the whistleblower, Facebook whistleblower, and then there was just a lot going on in marketing that made me feel icky every single day when I went to work. And then I burned out, and that was really kind of where all that came from. It wasn't so much the hours that I worked, it wasn't so much the people that I was leading at the time. It was the industry that burned me out. I could not handle. And so when I came back from that burnout, I almost immediately, not immediately, but like within 3 months, I had started writing the book, but I had also started my exit strategy. Like, I had started
Mm.
working my exit strategy about 7 years before I had planned to exit the company, because I just knew, like, there was no way I was going to be able to stay in the industry. So my career has, I don't regret anything. I'm very thankful for all of my experience in accounting, because it's made a lot of business related conversations and topics much easier for me to just get and understand. And I don't regret my 15 years spent in marketing, because I learned how to do so much with marketing. I've just been
Very
very
good.
fortunate. Yeah. So I would say, for your audience, pay attention to those moments that come. Like, don't just brush them away as a one off. Like, if you're getting asked to teach or lead or speak in your organization, pay attention to that, because people are seeing things in you that you don't see in yourself yet.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's where the path shows up, is when other people see something in you and ask you to do something that you wouldn't even think of yourself doing that, but then you're like, yeah, this fits and this feels good. So pay attention to those moments, because they do. I mean, they show up for all of us. It's just a matter of, if we can pay attention to them and explore them.
Yeah, that's so cool because there are probably so many natural talents that you have that you didn't even know
Hmm.
you had.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
then just
go ahead.
no, just quickly back to the burnout. What are like the main warning signs? Because we've of course covered some things. Because I
Hmm.
think just a lot of women are not really sure, like, do I have a burnout or not? Like, I don't know. So, what do you say the most common things to watch
Yeah.
out for?
So I break burnout. I see burnout happen in three stages, and they typically happen in this order. The first is attentional, the second is emotional, and then the third is physical. So if we look at attentional burnout, that is, you can't remember things. You can't have a coherent conversation or a clear conversation. You are just very distracted all the time. Those are some of the initial signs of burnout. And if you don't catch it there, it usually goes into emotional burnout, which is, and emotional burnout is a little bit harder to for others to see it, but that's when you might be a little bit more irritable, or you might be checked out. You might just be numb. You might be indifferent to what's going on. There might be some apathy. I hear in that stage, there's a lot of I don't know and I don't care. Like that's kind of the feeling that I would describe. If those are the two feelings that show up in that stage. And then unfortunately, if you don't kind of catch it in those two stages, then you get into the physical burnout signs. And that's what we were talking about earlier, like the exhaustion, the depression, the getting sick, the shingles, the right shoulder hurting, your back hurting. Um, Basically your body doesn't feel right. Your whole body, like something is hurting, something is aching, or you're just getting sick a lot more than you used to, or there's not enough sleep in the world. And when you get to that point, I always tell people they need to check in with their medical provider first to make sure there isn't something else going on. But if you go to the doctor and they're like, all your blood work's fine, everything looks fine, it's probably stress. Well, it's probably burnout is actually you've had stress for too long is what's happened, and it's turned into burnout. So my goal really, Christy, is to try to help people catch it in those first two phases, that attentional or the emotional, recognize it, and then turn it around before we get all the way into physical burnout. That's really my main focus, because I do think I think just the world we live in, we're likely to go through burnout. I mean, all the stats support, like the numbers are just kind of off the charts with people who experience it. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and then it's a matter of just being aware and dealing with it before you get into a situation where you're going to the emergency room with a panic attack.
So, what are your main tips on preventing a burnout then?
So
Catching it.
the first is awareness. I mean, the first thing is like knowing what it looks like on you. So one, I'll just give you some examples for me. One thing that I do is I will say, I just have to a lot. Like I will say, I just have to get through, or I just have to finish. There's a lot of, I just have tos. And if I'm saying that, I kind of put the brakes on and say, what is going on here? So you have to know what it looks like on you. And I think that the way that you learn that is you look back at past times where you were really stressed, and you say, like, what were my tendencies then? What were my coping mechanisms then? What was I doing? Was I consuming more alcohol? Was I gaining weight? Was I losing weight? What did I was I short and irritable with people? Did I cancel plans last minute with friends and family? Did I isolate? Like knowing, looking back, I think one of the best things we can do is just look back at periods in your life where you were really stressed, and identifying what that looked like. And that's where you start, because you have to know what it looks like on you. And then the other thing that I always recommend is, out of that, let's find one or two things we can measure. So one thing that's easy for me to measure is sleep. Another thing that I often hear from my clients is, if they have kids, they want to be involved in their children's after school activity. So like sports or recitals, that type of thing. So we can put that on the schedule. And, you could say like, well, when I'm burned out, I only get 5 hours of sleep a night. So if you start to notice you're only getting 5 hours of sleep a night, it might be an indicator that, hey, you're heading towards burnout. It's time to address what's going on with the scheduling thing. And that could even be like working out. Like maybe you work out 3 or 4 times a week. If you find yourself you're only working out once a week, or not at all, or if you're missing all of the games, so you're not making any of them, you might be headed towards burnout. Like I always look for things that are very measurable. And then what I do is we find the baseline, like what's your normal, and then what does burnout. And usually most people, if they do this exercise, they'll find that they're somewhere in the middle there. And that's what it's all about, is identifying when you're not at your baseline normal level, but you're not quite to burnout yet. If you could figure out like, well, I've only gotten 5 hours of sleep, 3 nights this week, but I did get 8 the rest. Well, okay, I'm probably not all the way to burnout yet, but I'm headed that way if I don't get corrected. So that's those are those red flags and those indicators that um, and very measurable. That's the thing that I think is very important is that we have some measurements over this. You know, we pick some things. It's not just these really subjective indicators. I really look for objective, measurable, almost like KPIs type indicators for people that can help them, know if they're heading towards burnout or not. Because I think that's the hardest part of this is knowing if you're heading there. We all walk around assuming that everybody is as stressed out as we are, or it's just the way that it is, or this is just how life is, or this is just this crazy time in my life. And it might be a crazy time in life, but it doesn't mean you should burn out over it, and I think that you have to be able to identify what's normal and what's not, and then try to catch it before it gets all the way into that not normal, that burnout arena. And by doing that, you can turn things around.
Very good to know, yeah, on yourself, all these factors, and
Oh
then you
yeah.
can regulate it yourself. That's really, yeah, I've never thought about it like that. And
Yeah.
then, on average, like, how long do people have a burnout? Because sometimes you also hear that people have been like not working for like a year. Is it very common, or is it
It
more common because you said 6 weeks you didn't work?
mhm. Yeah, I think it's different for everybody. It depends on what happened. I work with business owners, and I don't know, business owners tend to not take a lot of time off. So, um, I have heard some people needing to take a year or two off. And if you can do that,
That's a
if
long
you're,
time, 2 years.
that's a long time to take off. I mean, I very much subscribe to the you can recover from burnout while you're still working.
Mm.
And I think that's actually a little bit, I personally believe that's a little bit of a better practice because it's almost like you're building these resiliency skills and you're learning how to set boundaries in a working environment. I think if you take a year off, it's almost like taking a vacation. Vacations don't fix burnout. So when you go on a vacation, if your job is causing you burnout or if your life is causing you burnout, you're just escaping it. You're not fixing it. So I do think that burnout actually requires us to continue to do work. It's a different work. It's a different prioritization. You have to look at things a little bit differently. You've got to decide what's top priority. You got to decide what you can stop doing for a while, what you can delegate, what you can eliminate. Go through those activities. But I think I think a better practice is to continue working, even if it's part time, while you are dealing with burnout, because that's going to teach you. You're going to learn how to manage work and your own well being at the same time. Now if you take a year off, you don't get that practice. So then you're going to come back into the same career. Like there would have to be some major life changes going on during that time for me to
Yeah.
think like that would be the way to handle burnout.
And I think maybe, if you are always used to being busy, doing things, seeing people, that if you all of a sudden are like, no, you have to sit at home and do nothing, that can also really lead to depression and like, then
Hmm.
you can sit at home on the couch still. I mean, I think I would go crazy.
Especially if you're an extrovert, which a
Yes.
lot of high achieving people, they're either a lot of them are extroverts or ambiverts. Like they need that. Well, most of us need some type of social interaction. Like that's a human condition of needing that social interaction. The amount of social interaction that you need varies from person to person. But yeah, I mean, I remember even when I went through my last burnout, I came back to work on Monday. I think it was Monday, yeah. And I told the team what had happened. I told my team, I was like, listen, you need to run the business. You're gonna have to run the business for a couple of weeks while I get my bearings because it was. I mean, panic attacks are uh, they are intense, and you don't just bounce back from a panic attack. Like a weekend of sleep does not fix what caused a panic attack. And I was really fortunate, and they did. Like I had set it up so they could run the business. But even so, I definitely took a whole week off, and then I probably the following week worked like 5 hours that week communicating with my key employee mostly. And then I came back for 2 weeks. I was definitely more like part time. So there was a solid 4 week there that I went from like working, all in to dropping back to a different pace of work. But that's what I needed to do to get my feet back under me and get my bearings. And then I was able to get back into it. I do think it would be hard to go from all of the work to none of the work and then go back to all of the work. Like
Yes.
there's a pacing thing there that doesn't make sense to me. Some
No.
people do it though. I have a friend that she took a 2 year sabbatical um from work. I mean, she spent 3 years preparing for it, took a 2 year sabbatical from work. Ultimately that she launched a business out of it. But um it varies for different people, but I think if the sabbatical is the route you go, something has to be drastically different on the other side of it for you to
Yeah.
not just immediately get back into burnout again.
Yeah, and that was my other question. Did you say, okay, usually for a lot of people, a burnout is inevitable, but what about a second one or a third one? Is it very common that people fall back into it, or do you say, well, with the right guidance and everything, then it doesn't really
I
happen again?
I my my guidance on that is still kind of out because I do see I see a lot of business owners, even though they're aware of it, still go through it. And what I find is it's it's more things that are out of their control. So I'll give you an example. Last summer, yeah, summer of 2023, my starting in April of 2023, my dad started having health problems and he was falling, and it led to this whole. I mean, it was this whole summer of him just being sick the whole time. Like he had 3 strokes. He
Okay.
went to the hospital for pneumonia. He had to do 2 weeks in rehab in a rehab center for the pneumonia to get his strength back. And then we all decided together as a family, my brother, sister, and I, and my mom and dad, of course, that they needed to leave their home. Like they needed to get out of their home because they weren't able to maintain this a lot, all of the typical stuff you have with aging
Yeah.
parents.
Yeah.
So on the heels of him finally getting recovered from having all these strokes, we went straight into moving them,
Hmm.
which was, and so during that time, I was having periods of like what I call acute burnout, which is there's something that happens. You know what the cause is. The difference between acute burnout and chronic burnout, those are the two timelines that I usually talk about. Acute burnout usually shows up uh, because something happened, like, and that for me, I mean, I was definitely having periods of time where I felt burned out, but I don't think I ever got all the way into full on, like, I didn't get all the way into physical burnout because I knew the signs and symptoms of what was going on. So I immediately started working my prevention plan. I immediately got into looking at what I've done in the past and just taking, like, implementing those self-care actions and working on those things to make sure that I didn't get into full-on burnout. So I think it's more of a I think when people have multiple burnouts, the more you have, if you've addressed the ones in the past, and some people just never address it. They change jobs. I mean, that's also not the answer to all. That's not always the answer to addressing burnout. Changing jobs is not the answer. Like, it's not always the workplace that's causing the burnout. Like, there's also something within us that, whether we're people pleasers or perfectionists or micromanagers, like there's something usually that we do that does not help and that can lead to burnout as well. So um I think that people who have gone through burnout and actually have addressed it in the past, they may have other burnouts, but they're just more aware of what's going on. And a lot of the times it's, something comes out of the blue that causes it. I had a friend who's a business owner friend who's in 1 week, she literally had 4 of her management team she runs a law practice of about 35 people, but she had 4 people on her management team let her know that they were all going on maternity leave within the next year. And then one of her parents was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and then one of her, I think it was her mom, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and then her father-in-law was also diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 1 week.
Oh, that's
That would
crazy.
put anybody into burnout, and none of that she could control. She had no control over any of that. So there are things that happen that make it, it's hard to people still go through burnout, even if they are the most you know even if they really focus on their well-being and they
Yeah,
really try to set boundaries at work. Like, stuff happens, life
stuff happens.
happens,
Yeah,
and you still end up with some of those things that push you into burnout.
sure. Okay, any last, I think we should reckon round off now. Any last piece of advice for women who have experienced a burnout and who want to find a new career? Um,
I Yeah, I would say the first thing is, like, just recognize it and know what you did. But one of the best things, the one thing I tell everybody when they twist my arm, like, what's the solve for it? You've got to have a support group of people who are experiencing a similar life to you. So it's for me, it's I've got to have other entrepreneurs.
yes.
I have like 4 other entrepreneurs that I can reach out to at any time and tell them, this is the stuff that's exploding and this is what I need help with. So it just depends on who you are. Like, it might be, another mid-career woman who has kids. Like, if that's you, then you need to find other people like that you can reach out to, who are not going to judge you, and who you can talk to about all of it. Like, it's really important to find those support individuals that you can just pick up the phone and call and talk with about things, and be really completely honest and open with them about what's going on, because that's the only way you heal, is when you get really real about what you're dealing with. um, and you need people who understand at least some of the path that you're on to talk with. So that's the big piece of advice I give people when they're dealing with this.
It's so important to not feel alone, and there's so much shame in it. And once you just share your story, that's already very healing just by talking about it to someone.
Yeah, and you've got to it's also it's I always recommend people build that before they need it. It's almost like in business they tell you to get your banking relationship in order before you need it. It's the same thing. Like, make sure you have that support group
Hmm.
before you actually need the support. It's really important, I think, to build that out, because it's crucial. You have to have that to get through this life, I think, and get to the other side of burnout.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I thought maybe just to round off, you could show us your book for the
Oh
people
yeah,
who.
sure. Yeah, it's Burned: How Business Owners Overcome Burnout and Fuel Success. Whoop, there we go.
Nice.
Anywhere you buy books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's actually, the audiobook just came out last week, so it's also available now, which is really exciting. It's all kinds of formats, and you can find it anywhere books are sold.
And also important to note that it's not just for business owners, but it's
Mhm.
also interesting for women just working, in the office for an employer.
I I've had a lot of non-business owners read it, and the overall, yeah, that's the overall, like, anybody can read it and get something out of it. If you're in the office working, if you have a job. I mean, even had some stay-at-home moms read it, who have
Wow.
said, "Oh my gosh, you have no idea how much this has spoke to me, and I'm not even a business owner." So yeah, there's a second edition probably coming that removes business owner from the title, but yeah, I wrote it. It was almost like a love letter to business owners, because I'm so passionate about them. But yeah, anybody can get a lot out of it.
Cool. Thanks so much for your time today. I thought it was really interesting and very informative as well. Yeah, thanks everyone for watching and for listening. And till next time.
Thanks.